Hey guys, it's Courtney, and I am here with 5 cards, 1 kit using the August 2020 card kit by Simon Says Stamp. And these are going to be very, very simple. And I am starting off with this large stamp set here, and I'm starting with this strip. It's just basically a solid strip, and I'm going to use this a couple of times during the video, but I'm just lining that up on the bottom portion of my card, not all the way towards the bottom, but kind of towards the bottom. And I'm using my MISTI here, and I'm using the lines on the MISTI door. So I'm going to line it up the best I can. And then when I close my MISTI door, I can kind of use the lines on that grid just to make sure that it is completely straight before doing my stamping. Went ahead and stamped that out with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and I previously dropped my ink pad, so I have some cat hairs on there. So make sure you clean up any pet hair on your stamps, or else you're going to see those little hairs. So let that dry for about a minute or two. It is a fast drying pigment ink, but it doesn't dry immediately. And then I'm going to mask that out with some Post-it note tape. Then I'm going to line up some of the other images, and this is straight basic stamping. This is like stamping 101 here. So I'm going to start with this little cloud. And I'm going to use all Simon Says Stamp dye inks here. And I'm using the Maliblue. It's just a very pale blue. Now, when you're using the Simon Says Stamp dye inks, I believe the Gina K are very similar, as well as the Hero Arts. They're basically shadow inks, which means that they're going to look a little blotchy, but as they seep into the paper and completely dry, they will even out. The color will even itself out. So I'm going to stamp the sun rays next, and then I'm going to line up the little circle that's the actual sun right there in the center. And I'm using the same ink for this one. It's the Duckling ink, but I'm going to stamp the circle twice just to have it a little bit different than the sun rays itself. I was going to add these little sunglasses to my son, but realized I just didn't allow myself enough room. But don't worry, I'll use them again in a future card in this video. So I have a ton of white space. I know it's a clean and simple card, but I have a little bit too much white space. So I'm going to trim this down just 1/4 of an inch off the top and the one side. And I'm also taking a piece of black cardstock, and I'm going to cut that just a little bit larger than my card panel, but still a little bit smaller than my card base. And then I can move on to the sentiment. And I'm going to use 2 sentiments here. So I'm going to start with the larger one here on the top, and I'm going to center that the best I can. And once again, stamp that with that VersaFine Onyx Black ink. Now for the remaining part of my sentiment, I'm going to use one of these tiny little sentiments that come in the stamp set, and I'm going to heat emboss right directly onto my little black strip that we started with. So I'm going to treat that with my anti-static tool, and you will want to make sure all of your ink is completely dry before doing this. Then I can carefully line that up, stamp that with some Versamark ink, sprinkle on some white embossing powder, and heat set that. Now, before you rub off that residue from your anti-static tool, you will want to make sure that your embossing powder is cooled down. It doesn't take that long, but just don't go in immediately to wipe off that extra powder, or else you're just going to smear those areas that are still hot. So once that is cooled down, I went ahead and adhered this down to that black cardstock that's just a little bit larger. I did have some warping. I typically do heat up my heat gun for about 30 seconds or so before bringing it to the paper, but I guess I was just a little impatient. I figured it was such a small area, and I didn't do that. So I have a little bit of warping. I use the wet glue, so it's kind of easy to kind of stick down. If it's not really sticking that well, it gives me a couple of seconds to shift things around. But went ahead and adhered that to my card base, and last added some sparkle to the cloud and the sun, and that is it for card number 1. Now for card number 2, I'm not doing any stamping or anything. I'm going to be using some of the papers from the kit. And I'll let you guys know, if you've never watched my channel before, I enjoyed working with the card kit, but it is very, very, very different than what my typical style is. So I did struggle a little bit. I'm not the type to use a lot of pattern paper. I'm not the type to use ephemera. I'm not the type to use stickers, which is why I didn't even bring them out. Typically, if I get stickers in a kit, I save those for envelopes when I actually mail out cards. So that's where they'll be used for, but they won't actually be used for any of these cards. So they are very simple, but also if you've ever watched one of my 5-card 1 kit videos, you'll also notice that I don't hardly bring in any other materials. I like to stick to pretty much the contents of the kit, with the exception of a couple of inks and, some basic tools that we all have laying around, but I don't bring out fancy dyes or anything like that, because I just like to show you guys what you can actually do with the kit without having to have a ton of materials. So I went ahead and cut out some of the cardstock and some of the pattern paper and one of these little sentiment things here. I guess they could sort of kind of look like ephemera once I'm all done with it. And then I cut down 2 of these little strips from this one pattern paper here. I'm not really sure how you're supposed to use this, but this is the way I used it. And I also used some of the green cardstock that comes in the kit, and that will actually be my card base. So I created an A2 card base with that. So next I'm going to kind of put everything together here. So I am going to start off with a white piece of cardstock, and this is cut just a little bit smaller than the card base, so I have a little bit of that green showing. I'm kind of just lining things up here to see how I want them. I keep it simple. I'm not good with pattern paper. I'm not good with mixing patterns, I should say. I admire those who can. I just don't have the eye for that. So I adhered that white panel there, and for this little strip of the green pattern paper, I am going to just do a fishtail here. I just cut a slit up the center and then bring the corners to the top part of that slit, and then you have a fishtail banner. So I adhered that down with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to my white panel here, and then I'm going to adhere these blue strips towards the bottom. So one of them is kind of just a design, and then the other one says let's party or something like that. I don't know, something like that. I can't see while I'm doing my voiceover, it's too small. But I adhered that down to the bottom portion of the card panel just to bring in a little bit of the blue, because the ephemera piece that I'm using has a blue border around it, and I didn't want that to be the only blue on the card. So once that was adhered down, I'm going to take some foam tape and I'm going to cover up this entire piece of ephemera. Normally I would just use a couple of pieces and leave some empty space, but in this case I'm covering up the entire thing because I don't want there to be any gaps, because I'm going to be adding some moisture to this with some Crystal Glaze by Nuvo, which is very similar to Glossy Accents, so you could certainly use Glossy Accents in place of this. So I adhere this down right to the center top portion of the card base, and then I'm going to bring out this Crystal Glaze, and I'm going to cover up the entire thing. Now, if you guys have ever decorated sugar cookies with royal icing, you do it the same way. You basically outline it and then flood it. So you're basically creating a border, and this will kind of frame everything in, and then I'm just going to fill in the rest and kind of let it spread out to that border that we've already created, and then I can go back in and fix any areas that I missed. I also added a few extra drops of this just as an embellishment kind of around the card to kind of fill in some of those blank spaces. But that is it for card number 2. Now, card number 3, we are going to create our own background, which is something I enjoy doing a lot more than just using pattern paper. And I'm going to bring out this strip again that we used in the very first card. And I'm going to line that up. I'm using my regular size MISTI. And I'm starting off with the card panel being on the bottom corner, and I'm lining this strip up on the top. Now I'm going to cut this down, so I'm not really worried about if I don't get a perfect stamped image on all the way off to the left, so I'm not concerned with that. But I'm going to be using 3 different color inks here. So I'm going to stamp this once, then I'm going to shift my paper up 1 inch. And I'm just using the ruler or the measurements on my MISTI so that it's pretty much the same. Is it going to be exact? No. But is it going to be noticeable? Probably not. So each time I'm just going to shift that up 1 inch and then stamp that out again. And I'm using the same ink color here. So I'm going to go all the way up or all the way down, I should say. I'm moving the card panel up, but I'm going down the card panel. Even if it hangs off your MISTI a little bit, it's fine. Just don't add a lot of pressure. With a stamp like this and most stamps, you don't have to add a lot of pressure to it. You just have to add even pressure in order to get a good stamped impression. So I worked my way all the way down that panel, and I'm going to finish off. I started with this one, and I'm going to finish off with this one as well. And then I'm going to clean off my stamp really well, because now I'm going to move on to a lighter color, but I'm going to use the same stamp. Now, I should have started with the lighter color, but these are all fairly light, so I didn't have too much of an issue. So I clean that up, and then I'm going to shift back down my panel, but I'm not going to bring it all the way to the corner. I'm going to bring it up 1/4 of an inch. Make sure that everything lines up, and then I'm going to move on to this duckling ink. Now, I did stamp off on a scrap piece of paper just to make sure there wasn't any of that orangey color left over, and then I can start stamping onto my panel. So stamp that just like I did before, and I'm going to bring it up 1 inch each and every time, but instead of the 1 inch mark, it's going to be the 1 1/4, 2 1/4, 3 1/4, and so on. So moved all the way down the panel that way with the same thing as I did the first time around. Then I'm going to bring in this other stripe. And I guess it's actually 2 little stripes, but they're much, much thinner than this one. And I'm going to do my best to line this up in between the orange-ish, and yellow stripe here. Again, doesn't have to be perfect. It's handmade. No such thing as perfect when it comes to handmade. So I'm going to bring in the darkest orange now, and I have this all the way down at the bottom corner. Going to stamp that out, and then again, move it up 1 inch each and every time. That way I don't have to keep lining up my stamp. It's already lined up because I've done the same measurements over and over and over again. So you can do all kinds of patterns with just these 2 stamps, but I kept it nice and simple. So like I said, I wasn't really concerned about the stamp not going all the way off to the left-hand side because I am going to trim this down. So I trim this down 1/4 of an inch, and then again, I'm going to take another piece of black cardstock to cut that a little bit larger than the panel, but still smaller than the card base. I really like to mat things on black, especially very simple cards, because it seems to make everything just pop. So line that up onto my black cardstock, and then line that black cardstock onto my card base. And at this point, I really wasn't sure what I was going to do with the sentiment, but decided to keep it real simple. But I'm also going to decorate the inside of this one. So I'm going to bring out my mini MISTI here, and I'm going to stamp out one of the larger sentiments from the large stamp set. And again, I stamped that out with the VersaFine Onyx Black ink, that quick drying pigment ink. I really like this for sentiments. I feel like 9 times out of 10, well, no, not even 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, I get a really good impression. I only have to stamp it once, and I don't, as long as you give it time to dry, I don't really get much smearing. And I say that now, but wait till the last card. So for the inside of the card, I went ahead and stamped out that circle again, brought back out that duckling ink, and I'm going to create my sun. And this time I am going to bring out my little face and my sunglasses. I'm going to bring back out my Onyx Black ink to stamp out the little face as well as the sunglasses and the other portion of my sentiment, or the sentiment that is for the inside of the card anyway. So that will finish off card number 3. For card number 4, I'm going to bring out some more of this pattern paper. I'm going to use this, it kind of reminds me of the picnic blanket or whatever. I'm going to cut that down to an A2 size, and then I'm going to use this BBQ, these little squares here, and I started off with my regular size tonic trimmer, and then I ended up bringing out my mini one. For little pieces, I find that this little mini trimmer is the best. Sentiment strips and little pieces like this, it's so easy to line up. I never make a mistake. It's just my go-to for small things like this. So once I had all of my pieces cut here, I'm going to go ahead and assemble my card. So I have a piece of white cardstock, and I cut this 1/2 inch smaller than an A2 card so that I have a little bit of that border of the pattern paper showing, and cut this extra piece of this pattern paper down. And I figured I'll use this on my card as well. So I'm kind of just lining everything up to make sure I have my placement right before I actually move on to the stamping. This time I'm actually going to do a little bit of stamping anyway. So I'm going to use 2 of these sentiments from the smaller stamp set that comes in the kit and kind of just line those up before bringing out my mini MISTI. That way I know that I'm allowing myself enough space for this little BBQ. I guess you'd call it ephemera, or maybe they're the cutout pieces. I'm really not sure what the technical term of it for it is. So once I had the stamp lined up, I can remove those little pieces of pattern paper, and I'm going to stamp these with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it's a Copic safe ink. Now, typically I do not stamp my sentiments with this, but for the sentiment on the bottom, I wanted to fill in the letters with my Copic marker, so I added a little bit of color to them. And this is a Copic safe ink, and being I'm stamping one sentiment with it, why not stamp the other? Except for the fact that I went to stamp them twice and my paper shifted. So rather than wasting this paper, I'm going to just flip it over. I didn't do a whole lot of stamping. There's no coloring, so there's nothing that's going to seep onto the other side of it. So I just use the other side. I'm going to take one of my red Copic markers just to very carefully fill in those letters. I'm not going to bother to do any shading for these. I just want to add a little bit of color. You'll notice that my marker is straight up and down, and that way I can just use the tip of the marker to get into those tiny little areas. So filled in all of the letters with the same color. Like I said, didn't bother to mix things up too much here. Now I can assemble my card. So I'm going to take a white A2 size card base, and remember our pattern paper is that same size, so we're not going to necessarily have a border there, but I adhered this flat down to my card base, and then I can adhere that white panel right in the center. And the good thing about a pattern paper like this is that you can use the lines. They're straight lines, so you can use them as your guide to kind of make sure that everything is lined up correctly. I also adhered this little extra piece of the pattern paper kind of in the center, but maybe a little bit down, but I'm lining it up so it looks as if it's kind of like seamless with the background, if that makes any sense, so that the pattern kind of just continues throughout the card. So I also took 2 tiny little strips of black cardstock that I have left over, and they're very, very skinny little pieces. And I'm going to adhere them on the top and bottom of this little strip because I noticed that even though this comes from the same paper pack, the red on the pattern paper and the reds on the BBQ pieces are slightly different. So in order to break that up a little bit, I figured that black cardstock would just kind of separate them enough where you won't really be able to tell too much. So I used some wet glue to adhere my BBQ there, and I worked kind of quickly just in case I needed to shift those around a little bit, but it kind of worked out good. My sentiment that I stamped wasn't exactly straight, but it is what it is. So because I have that crystal glaze still out, I am going to go ahead and fill in just the letters themselves with this. And this will just add a little bit of dimension and a little bit of shine. Don't be too concerned if you go out of the lines a little bit. What I typically do is, because this flows a little bit faster than glossy accents, I feel like you don't have as much control. I just take my craft knife and kind of scoop up any excess and scoop it where it needs to go. Just kind of push it where it needs to go. And that is it for this card. Moving on to the 5th and final card here, I have another piece of Neenah Solar White. This is 5.5 by 4 1/4, and I'm taking 2 pieces of Post-it note tape and I'm masking off the top and the bottom. Then I'm going to bring out my mini MISTI and I'm going to stamp 2 of the images from the smaller stamp set from the card kit. So I'm going to use this little grill here and the big BBQ. And once again, I am going to stamp this with my Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because, of course, this time we are actually going to be doing some Copic coloring. So actual Copic coloring. So I ended up stamping these a couple of times, and honestly, I just didn't want to cut masks. I knew that there was going to be I knew I wasn't going to be able to do it for the letters, but especially especially the letters, but even the grill. I just didn't want to cut those little tiny pieces. So I'm going to use some masking fluid by Nuvo. And I've been using this a lot lately. I've been kind of obsessed with it. But it's so easy to use. You just have to kind of make sure that there's no air bubbles. So every once in a while, I might squirt a little bit off onto a scrap piece of paper just to make sure I'm not getting any air bubbles there. It does take a little bit of time to dry, and you will want to make sure that it is completely dry. And you'll see why in here in a minute, because I didn't necessarily wait as long as I should have. But this kind of saves you from fussy cutting those really teeny tiny intricate areas. So once that was almost dry anyway, I'm going to do just a very, very simple ink blending in the background, just the illusion of a sky and grass. So I'm going to use broken china and tumbled glass for my sky. So I started out with the broken china, brought down that area with the tumbled glass, and then I added a little bit more of that broken china just to darken up the top portion of the sky, just to have a little bit of variation, for no other reason than that. But you can certainly use two colors here. It wouldn't be a huge deal. Now for the grass, I'm going to be using mowed lawn and shabby shutters. So I added a little bit of the mowed lawn all the way down at the bottom, and then extended that up a little bit with the shabby shutters. And this is basically going to be, the shabby shutters is going to meet the tumbled glass, which don't necessarily blend, but you're not going to get too much of a weird look with it as long as you go back to the blue. So go back to the blue and blend that into the green, and it will give you the illusion that you have a sky and grass without having to do any masking or anything. So once that was done, again, I should have let it dry for a few minutes, but I didn't. I'm going to go ahead and remove the Post-it note tape from the bottom and the top of my card panel. And I just use a regular eraser, just a regular old eraser to remove the masking fluid. Now, what you want to do is you just want to go lightly over it. I'm not adding hardly any pressure at all here. And you'll have to go over it a couple of times before it starts to kind of release from the paper. And I had no problem with the letters at all. But then I got to the grill, and this area, this larger area, was just not dry enough. I should have given it another couple of minutes, and it tore my paper a little bit. So at this point, I'm not starting over. It is what it is. We're going to work with it the way it is, and we're going to move on to the coloring. But you can see that I lost a little bit of the outline there, and I still have my stamps lined up in my MISTI. So I'm able to just pop my panel back in there and restamp that, and we'll fix up that little white area that we have between the image and the sky. Just took a couple of markers that closely fit. I mean, you could tell that it's different. I should have probably used my Copic chart to really match it up, but I just kind of guessed. But again, it is what it is. It's handmade. So once I kind of had that area blended out a little bit anyway, I'm going to move on to the coloring of the images themselves. Now I guess these are supposed to be maybe little sausages. I'm not doing a whole lot of shading here. I'm just going to add two colors for these, and for that little hot dog in the middle, I'm just adding one single color. Not going to bother to do any shading for that. Now for the top portion of the grill, as well as the wheel, and I guess you'd call it the legs, the stand portion of the grill, I'm going to switch over to some cool grays. I'm not worried about any kind of light source here. It's just I'm adding a little bit of variation in color. That's it. There's not really a whole lot of thought that needs to go into this particular image. So if you're new to coloring, this is a really good image to practice on. So I'm using a 3-color blend here for the grays. My C7 was the darkest color, and then I'm going to finish off with the C3. Then I'm going to move on to the red combination for the actual grill, and I'm going to use these for the letters as well. So I'm going to start right with my darkest color, which I don't typically do, especially when I'm using not a natural blending family, but because I have some ripped paper and I was concerned about the bleeding, I am going to start right with that darkest color. So I'm just adding a little bit of shading underneath the top portion of the grill, and then a little bit on either side, and also that little knob thing that we have going on off to the right hand side. Going to blend that out with the R56, then the R85, and finish off with the R83. And these are more of a pink tone, but You always want a little bit of variation as far as the shadows and highlights so that you get that dimension. Now I'm going to kind of do the same thing for the letters. So you just basically want to pick a side where you want your shadow to be. Doesn't really matter what side that is. I chose the left side. So I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to the left-hand side, but also I'm going to add it to the left-hand side of the other side of the letter, if that makes any sense. Because all three or both of these letters have openings to them, the B and the Q, I'm going to add a little bit to the opposite side as well on the left-hand side, if that makes any sense. That doesn't make any sense. I already know that doesn't make any sense, but hopefully you'll be able to see what I'm talking about rather than hear what I'm talking about, because apparently my words are just not working today. My vocabulary always seems to disappear when I'm doing a voiceover anyway. So just finishing up the coloring here, and then I will stamp out the rest of my sentiment, another one of those little sentiments from that small stamp set. I'm going to use that same VersaFine ink on top of that BBQ. Then I can adhere this down to my card base. Now again, I said this is a quick drying pigment ink, but it is not immediate. And I'm telling you guys this, but I'm not listening to my own words. So when I actually adhered this down to my card base, I kind of flicked my hand over it and smeared some of my ink. Now, because I have Distress Oxide underneath here, there's really not much I can do about it. It is what it is. But in order to kind of cover up that torn paper, I'm going to bring back out this Crystal Glaze. I told you I only use very few materials when I work with kits. And I'm just going to go over the grill as well as the letters. And that way you'll never be able to tell that that paper was actually kind of torn underneath there. So that is it. That is it for the fifth and final card from the August 2020 card kit. Here's a quick look at all 5 cards that we created today. As always, I will leave a list of supplies, the very few supplies that I used, in the description box below. Thanks guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.